Sanos. I'm the Market Development Manager for Commodities in Europe, and I'll be chairing this panel on digital transformation today. So we have three industry leaders. We have Antti from the Boston Consulting Group, we have Leigh Johnson from PwC, and we have Leigh Henson from Refinitiv. And they will sharing their insights on the transformation that is actually happening in the energy ecosystem. One of the buzzwords that you will be hearing today a lot is digital. So to stay true to this buzzword, we're live streaming the sessions today over Twitter. So if you know of someone that wanted to be here but couldn't attend, just let them know. Before we start, let me ask you something, and you can provide your answer via the app that you have on your mobile. Where your company is in its digital transformation journey? Where are you? At what stage of the transformation your company is in? So use your app, and maybe we can start seeing some of the questions coming in. Do we already have some answers? Yes. That's the next one. The beauty of technology. That's Murphy's Law. If something can go bad, probably it will. Okay, so raise your hand. If you think that your company is just starting digital transformation, raise your hand. Now, if you think that you are somehow in the middle of the journey, raise your hands. More people. And what about if you're not sure? Okay, so it's becoming apparent that different companies are at different path right now. Which maybe, Antti, let's start with you probably. So, from your experience, what do you see the difference between the different commodities market in the revolution in digital? So let's say oil versus power versus agriculture.
So I think there is a bit of a two-speed world at the moment. So I visit a lot of these players on a regular basis, and what we're seeing now is that gas and power is really galloping really quickly into a new type of world. And that sort of was sparked by initially, the margins in the power and gas trading industry going down, and the need to do something around it. And they started really focusing on the cost, but at the same time they started figuring out, okay, we can do something on the margin side as well. So currently we are seeing some of the gas and power players going from a sort of traditional discretionary trading model into something more of a systematic hedge fund type of a model. And that's happening extremely quickly, and that's putting a lot of pressure on the governance, on the compliance, and all sorts of areas. Whereas if you look at the oil industry, they were stacking fat returns in the last sort of 3 to 5 years because of the contango. And they were not paying attention to this. So they are only in the last sort of year or two putting a lot of effort on the digital, and they really have a big gap between the power and gas industry to go after, but they are trying to start moving. Whereas if you look at, for example, agriculture, these guys have been working on it for quite some time. And if you look at players like Cargill, they're even monitoring the sound of shrimp eating in the sea. But they have a much more difficult market to operate in, which is super fragmented. You have a lot of quality issues, you have a lot of supply chain issues. So there is a lot more work to be done, whereas in power and gas, it's a very homogeneous product, and information is much more available, so they are much quicker to move. So it's a bit of a two-sided world where you have the power and gas industry moving very quickly. Oil is trying to catch up, and agriculture is a bit behind. And I would say metals is even further behind.
Thank you. Leigh, what is the innovation landscape look like? What are the cool things out there?
Nice question. I'm Leo. I head up the disruption team. I also do a Radio 4 program called Future Proofing about what's coming down the track 10, 15 years from now. It's unfortunately on at 8 p.m. on Wednesdays, which is the same time as Bake Off. Okay? So no one listens to this program. But there is some cool stuff coming, I think. If you look at these these light bulbs, the light coming from these light bulbs, 93% of that original power is gone. It's wasted. It's just been lost in the long transmission lines. We're locked into a century-old energy model. And the exciting stuff for me is how the component parts of the revolution, and there's multiple pieces of the puzzle, they're all slowly nudging into place. And you can see this different energy ecosystem starting to come to life. And there's pilots of it. It might be Power Ledger, it might be Brooklyn, what's going on with the microgrids. But what you're seeing is there is a model where you've got the potential for local, renewable, completely distributed energy production. And then, I hate to use the word, blockchain-enabled, peer-to-peer transactions, where we are not locked into this lossy, carbon-intensive world that's giving us some of the geopolitical challenges and climate challenges that we're confronted with. But it's giving us a model where we're suddenly empowered with low cost, potentially in some cases free, potentially in some cases energy that we're actually paid for. And it's low carbon, and it's powering our houses, it's powering our cars through the vehicle to grid connections. And the revolution that Henry Ford kicked off a century ago, where he unlocked the energy of fossil fuels to empower a new generation of people to do new things, better, cheaper, faster. You can see that there's a huge amount of potential. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but a potential upside to be created. And that's the stuff that gets me excited.
Thank you. And Leigh, blockchain made it into the discussion in less than 5 minutes.
I'm sorry.
So, what are the key technologies in energy trading?
So I think it's been very interesting to watch over the past 5 to 10 years. We've seen an explosive growth in the availability of fundamental information that's come from digital sensors and the Internet of Things. And this is increasingly measurable because of overlay and sophisticated analytics on the raw data that's available from sensors. So we see fundamental information like vessel movements coming from sensors such as AIS receivers. We see information about power production and consumption coming from electromagnetic sensors. We see whether or not refineries are operating or not coming from infrared cameras. We're looking at the impact of weather that's coming from satellite imagery. So I think it's very interesting to have seen that develop over the years, and the information is being available far more in a digital form than it ever was before. But I think that the focus is now shifting a little. It's not just the availability of that information, but it's what we do with it. So I think a key focus and shift that we're seeing right now is onto the platforms that people use in order to be able to bring that information together, and also the tools such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, other buzzwords that move around the industry. But those tools enable humans to analyse that combined content in a much better way. And we have a sort of strapline internally, we call it smarter humans with smarter machines.
Antti, I saw you nodding.
Yeah, that's indeed spot on. I think one of the best examples of that was when I was visiting one of my clients, and we were testing out the external provider of data. Actually, they could get better information about their own assets from the external party than they could from their own systems. So they got it faster and more reliably and better quality. And I call this the democratization of information. So, in the market, you used to be the king if you own the assets, you had the flow of information. But now you can just tap into external provider, satellite images, AIS data, for example. You have perfect visibility of all the boats on the sea, and you pay a couple of tens of grands a year. So that opens up the market for all sorts of new competition. So the old guys cannot just, rely on their old business model of, having the big assets and the big flows.
So it's a market which traditionally was opaque, but
That's
now
right.
is much less so.
Absolutely.
And what type of companies are leading the race?
So that's indeed a good question, and sort of if you look at the industries per commodity, obviously, as we discussed, the power and gas industry is leading the game. if you talk about pure sort of commodity traders, in terms of advancements. And funnily enough, the IOCs were very slow to move on this, and we've only seen a couple of them moving a bit now, and the merchants, in addition, were a bit slow to move as well. And my hunch is that one of the reasons why this has been difficult is that if you look at the merchant business model, for instance, is that everything has to be at the desk, everything has to be at the book. And if you look at digital, you have to be horizontal, you have to go across the books in systems, in data, in the way you organize analytics. And this has been completely, 90-degree turn from the way they've organized. And utilities were quicker to figure that out. And the IOCs and the merchants have been struggling. But in the last year or two, they've started moving. But surprisingly enough, it's not always the biggest and the traditionally most advanced. It's sometimes the smaller guys that are more nimble.
And more agile.
More agile in the approach.
And Leo, what is the next wave of disruption in energy trading? Let's say 5 to 10 years from now.
Okay, so this is all about timing. If the big sort of colliding megatrends make us think something's happening, there's an energy revolution that's slowly grinding its way towards us. The question is when, and what are the barriers? What are the accelerators? And what are the waves of disruption they really kick off? So, anyone who looks at the tech landscape right now, you've clearly got a massive barrier with the practicality of blockchain. Say, does it really work? Is it fit for purpose? And yeah, there's pilots, but they're small. They're on university campuses. They're small. And what's blockchain doing? It's doing 7 transactions per second versus Visa's 24,000. It's still a really high cost. Coinbase recent transactions, $16 fee on a $25 transaction. You've got a system that's not yet working, but you can see that with other fixes, it might be IOTA, with crowdsourced verification, it might be Hashgraph with voting for blockchain approval, other fixes. There will ultimately be some improvement. So my hunch is, if you're going to ask, is this going to happen faster than we expected or slower than we expected? You could see a couple of tipping points coming ahead. And one is around, it's going to be a really boring comment this, but a real accelerator for me, after we get around the barrier of blockchain, is tax. I said it was going to be boring, okay? So the IMF says that, I used to work at the World Bank, that there's $5.3 trillion of annual subsidy, direct or indirect, for fossil fuels. Is that going to stick around? Is that stable? Well, the thing that makes it unstable is if the technology, the substitutes achieve cost parity. We know by 2020, 80% of the world's going to be living in places where various forms of renewables are below or at cost parity with fossil fuels. That makes that 5.3 trillion vulnerable. So that, I think, will be a point of acceleration, as well as the gradual technological evolution of batteries, of nanotech, etc., all of which are promoting on a blockchain, this ecosystem to work. Then the question is, what are the disruptions that kicks off? And here's where I think, you see an awful lot of stuff get very interesting very fast. I mean, Chris was talking about Russia. What happens to the geopolitics of Russia historically when oil prices are down? It doesn't look pretty. If any of you in the room think you've got a pension, does anyone in the room think they have a pension, by the way? I was just checking. Forget the synthetic biology revolution and the increased liabilities that governments, councils, companies can't meet. Pension funds are heavily vested in fossil fuels. And if we do start to have this energy revolution, we know that there is going to be some level of stranded assets, some level of disruption around that. Throw into that, some of the risks of a financial crisis metastasizing into a sovereign debt crisis, some of the stuff that we're seeing with the weak signals of what's going on in Italy. You can see a lot of potential technological disruptions laying into the economic, the social, and ultimately political.
And there's also the ESG wave that is coming.
Absolutely. I mean, look at what's the Canadian pension funds and the pressure they're coming under right now for exactly these issues.
So, Leigh, we mentioned data a couple of times. Better data information are at the core of digitalization. But are there any other dimensions to this discussion?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to pick up on some of the points that you were making. I think another important dimension is process. So I think that it's a much more mundane subject than some of the things we've been talking about in terms of analytics and big data. But process is really important because it takes cost out of businesses. So I think that we'll see the widespread automation of manual processes. And that will be through the deployment and uptake of industry-wide platforms based on technology like blockchain. I mean, you don't need to have fast-performing technology just to give you the sorts of benefits that you can get from those types of platforms when it comes to automating process. So if we just take an example of the shipping industry, currently to move a cargo from A to B, there are multiple handoffs that have to happen. And many of those handoffs are using documents or spreadsheets that have been built and completed by manual input, and often those things are exchanged via email. And so it makes it incredibly hard to find the information or to maintain that information or even to share that information. And so it's not just about the speed that you can improve by speeding up paper-based manual processes or even the reduction of human error. It's also about ensuring that companies have access to up-to-date information. And if that information is digital in nature and it's maintained using automated means, then it's not only going to be available to improve operational factors, but also it can inform and support trading decisions as well. So yeah, I think I agree. Blockchain, there's a long way to go with blockchain, and it may even end up not being that type of platform. But I think the biggest challenge is getting people within an industry to collaborate together in order to put in place automated processes between each other across an industry to get the benefits that we can get from automating those processes.
So on the processes side, probably let's ask the audience, and hopefully technology will work at this stage. Using the poll app, let me ask you this. How challenging is for you to aggregate and normalize the different internal and external data sources that you're using? So if you could use the app, and maybe we can see the results on the screen. Yes. So it's still working, very challenging, somewhat challenging. Okay, probably we can close it there. We're getting an idea. This, I think, Leigh, is completely in line with what you were just saying. Antti, what is the end game of all this? Will we have at some point some traderless trading?
Yeah, that's really the question I get asked a lot. And to link a bit to Leigh's point, I think there is sort of 4 levels of evolution in the game. So the first level is where you started putting sort of screens in front of traders, like an icon screen, for example. So instead of phone brokering, just you give people access to the market. The second level is where you start to automate both your back office, mid office, and the front office functions. So putting execution algorithms or RPA in your back office, exactly what Leigh was referring to. The third level is where you start to have human assisted by a computer in making decisions, and we call it algorithmic assistance, where you have algorithms and machine learning figuring out insight from the data that you have. So to be able to do that, of course, you have to have your data in order and the processes in order. So you need the automation before you really can scale that up. And the fourth level is really where you start to question whether you need human in the game anymore. And if you really look at what the power and gas traders are doing right now, some of them are setting up for that end game. So they are going from desk-based systems to a functional system where everything is automated. You don't have traders anymore, you just have data scientists, you have analysts, you have programmers and developers. And that changes, 90% decrease what you're doing. Instead of focusing on commodities, you focus on the data and the algorithms or the infrastructure around it. So when I ask, head of trading always, the question, where do you think you will land, 1 to 4? They say oftentimes that the industry lands 3.5. So a lot of things you go to 4, especially on power and gas, where it's quite straightforward to do. Some things you don't do, and if you look at oil, for instance, physical oil will be very difficult to go all the way to 4. Like one Glencore guy said that every cargo of oil is like fine wine. It's unique, so it's much more difficult. But everybody believes that the market will reach somewhere between 3 and 4 in the next 5 to 10 years.
Which gives us a view on the future. And Leo, what are the impacts on business and society of this transformation in energy?
By the way, I like your reference to the wine, because at home where I live in Brent and Kilburn, I make wine with my neighbours from Kilburn grapes, and it's referred to affectionately as Brent crude. So, so I think it's, you can see a set of big waves of change happening in an energy system that all of our business models have been built up on. Fossil fuel-driven mass production, that's been the beast that's powered growth. You can see this revolution from mass to mass and micro fossil fuel to fossil fuel and renewable, and ultimately towards renewable. And, so what it looks like for the ecosystem is, I think, the end state, what decade we get there, anyone's guess. You've got to monitor the critical uncertainties, the weak signals of the deltas. But the end state looks like it's going to be an energy system that's dematerialized, that's distributed, that's decarbonized, that's potentially even demonetized, where the commodities move from a position of scarcity potentially to a position of something close in some territories to abundance. And if you just take the Hyperloop, it's another technology which is highly speculative. Yes, they're building Abu Dhabi to Dubai right now, but they don't know how to brake, and they don't know how to turn. Apart from that, it's looking great. So we don't actually know if this is going to really happen. But if it does happen, one of the potential strategies that they're assuming they could run the business model on is, forget the costs of the energy, forget the costs of the infrastructure, to be running it essentially as a zero marginal cost good with payment by data, because this will effectively be a 4D traveling iPod, potentially mineable for a huge amount of data that will be much more valuable than the energy. So I think there is going to be a very different landscape.
So it's an evolution which is a kind of revolution at the same time?
Yes.
So, and by the way, if you have questions for our panelists, you can use the app on your mobile. And this is also true for people who are watching the live stream over Twitter. You can ask your question using the Energy Interactive hashtag. So probably, Leigh, let me ask you probably the final question. How is Refinitiv best placed in helping our clients in moving into this digital transformation journey?
I just want to pick up on something that Antti was saying around, I think it was category 3 or category 4 or something. I think we are moving in that direction, but I think it's, our CEO, David Craig, likes to refer to us as a $6 billion startup, and that, I think when he uses those terms, he's actually really referring to the approach that we are increasingly taking in trying to help solve the needs of our customer base. So, just to give you an example, we're having multiple conversations right now with companies that simply want to analyse big data. I mean, it's no more complicated than that. And of course, they face many challenges. Some of the most basic ones they face are finding good sources of quality data, which to bring into their processes and into their databases. And then the next issue that they're facing is they need some sort of metadata framework in order to put all this data together so that they can apply analysis and visualization on top of it. I think that if you look at ultimately, whatever a technology company claims in terms of the platforms that they can provide, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about the quality of the content and the organisation of the content that has the most significant bearing on the success of the outcome. And that's something that we've been doing as a company for many, many years. There's over 1 billion updates. We run over 1 billion updates a day through our models. We make those updates available to customers in a very intuitive and efficient and effective manner. So it's very interesting when companies come and talk to us about the challenges that they're facing. There's a lot that we can do to help them with respect to content and the organisation of content. But interestingly, we're also starting to have conversations around some of the tools that we use internally to apply to the data that we collect internally, whether that's within our analyst group, many of whom, the members of whom are here today and you can talk to throughout the course of the day. They build machine learning algorithms and they run those algorithms, and that's part of what we do. But also we develop tools in the analysis and visualization space in our development labs within Refinitiv as well. So it's a combination of content, organisation of content, and the ability to operate on and visualise that content. They're very interesting conversations, and I think it may be a long time before we get to number 4, but certainly I think we're certainly with some of the companies that we're talking to, we're at the 3 stage already.
Thank you. And before we open the panel to questions, do we have any questions from the audience? Maybe something coming from the app already? But until things fill in, let me probably ask something to Antti. What are the typical pain points in your experience on this?
So it depends a bit on what your starting point is. I think the typical starting point is that you figure out that, okay, everybody's moving and we are nowhere, so what should we do? And it seems very sort of daunting in a sense, because you have data issues, you have infrastructure issues, you have human-related issues, you don't have the capabilities, you don't know where to focus, and you have typically something called mushrooming, so everybody's doing a bit of initiatives here and there in the organization, which might seem interesting but don't scale up. So if that's where you are, then I would say that the best way to sort of start is to actually get together, decide on what's 1 or 2 big things we want to focus on and start scaling up. Because otherwise, you will spread your focus to widen the organization and the topics, and that will lead nowhere.
So we already have, I don't know whether Leo, you want to add into this? We start having the questions coming through from you, so please keep using the app. The first one is whether digitalization is all about cutting costs.
So I can start with that. Absolutely not. I think there's two aspects to it. I think in our framework, level 2 is more about cutting costs and being efficient. Level 3 is actually much more about increasing the margins. And you can think about it, for example, that we worked on several topics such as sentiment analysis, and we created some pilots that have improved book returns by 20-25% in a very small time frame. These tend to fade out, so when everybody starts doing the same things, that's when the returns fade out. But if you're the first one, there's actually sizable margin to go after. The problem is that you have to keep figuring out new things to build, right? Because it's becoming an arms race, kind of like what equities trading became, that you have to be faster and faster in your cycle of creating new ideas and putting them in play. And that's really one of the pain points is you don't have the process to do that. You might be successfully building one application, but if you have to build on a continuous basis, that's where you struggle.
I think it's kind of, in a way, it's a huge political question, and it's kind of a civilizational question as well. I think we're at this point now where we need to decide, what do we want to do with the digital? It's what Kentaro Toyama said, technology is not the answer, it's the amplifier of intent. Do we want to use digital to blitz human intelligence to replace it with smarter machines? Or do we want to use it to unlock cognitive surplus, to empower new people to do new things? And I think in the energy space, nothing is more fundamental than giving people power. There's 1.4 billion people in the oil still because they don't have any power. And if you just think what technology could do just to unlock their capabilities, take an energy example like Copper, where they're trying to deal with the problem of the solar light, the D-light, because it costs $200, which if you don't have any power, you can't afford. By just a simple Internet of Things play, put a chip in it, then you can asset finance it for 50 or 60 cents a day, way less than they're spending on kerosene and firewood. You avoid all the health impacts from the smoke, and suddenly you've got a banking system. You can get a microloan for the Kickstarter hand pump, $36. Then you can use that to get access to the underground water table that's there for 98% of unirrigated sub-Saharan land. You can get microinsurance for your crops with geo-based weather payments if there's drought or flooding. And in one study, exam pass rates went up 58 to 83%, incomes went up from 180, taking 100 ahead per capita. And I think why this energy revolution and the distribution of the power of energy is so critical for an economy is it unlocks these two 10x's. The 10x's of including a population that's not just the urban and suburban affluent billion who right now get power, who get energy, but the whole 9 or 10 billion by then. And then it's taking their incomes up from 180 to 1800. So this distributed, inclusive economy, which I think a new energy system could unlock, has enormous potential to amplify human intelligence and human capabilities, not just replace it.
Thank you. And I'm seeing some very, very, very interesting questions. So how much time do we have?
About
10 minutes. So another question is, considering how highly interconnected energy trading currently is, in particular power trading, what do you see as the key enabler to make the switch to blockchain with a sustainable business model?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I was talking to someone who works very much in the space, and he was telling me that around a year ago, IBM had something like 400 pilots running across 600 organisations. They were all sort of proof of concept, and that's now down to 60. So there's obviously been a lot of hype around things like blockchain, and that's come somewhat back to earth. But of those 60 that are still running, very few of them have actually made it into live operation. And I think he was saying there were 3 main reasons why that was the case. The first one was that companies were very reluctant to join initiatives that had been started off by their competitors. So there's immediately this reticence to get involved from an anti-competitive standpoint. The other one is that a lot of these proof of concepts are actually focused on reducing costs and efficiencies and improving efficiencies. And the third one was that they weren't prepared to make the investment to take the proof of concept into a live environment. And it always strikes me as somewhat a little strange that people are prepared to spend a lot of money and invest in trying to grow their revenues, which is a lot about making digitalisation work in order to support growth of revenue, whereas they're not prepared so much to invest money in order to save cost, especially when you save cost, it goes straight to the bottom line.
I can complement that a bit. So we wrote an article on blockchain and commodities trading, and we took quite a skeptical view, to be honest. And 2 major reasons. One being that the power and gas industry has invested massively in the infrastructure. Sometimes hundreds of millions to make the interconnection work and automate processes. So what is the business case of going to blockchain? Because things are actually working fairly well today. If you look at the business case articulation of some of these initiatives, it's actually peanuts, what you say. And it would be a massive overhaul of the process and the system to go there. So why bother? And the other one is on the margin side. Not so much on gas and power, but especially on oil and less transparent commodities. You are putting your margins at risk if you're increasing the transparency. So you are both, putting your margin at risk, and you're not getting the cost benefit necessarily. So why would you go there? And that's what we are seeing, and that's why the pilots are not succeeding. Is because the industry just doesn't see the point. And it's good for image purposes, but when you really go to talk to the right people, they are all very skeptical. And that's why we took a bit of a skeptical stance if you look forward, and I stand to be corrected.
It's just like sometimes giving away your secret sauce.
Yeah.
In an environment where the margins are already going tight.
Right.
And speaking with companies out there, sometimes I think there is a confusion, I would say, between the use of blockchain and moving from analog to digital. So blockchain is one of the technologies that can help that. So it's not the only one. Another question I have, and I will not probably ask questions about blockchains again because they're flowing. I might know that's coming there. So I would say, do you believe that food automation, the stage 4 that you mentioned, will lead to more or less volatility in the market? What do you see? Why?
I may start and then I'll let the guys complement. So I think one way to look at it is that volatility is typically created by fundamental actions, and then there's some volatility created by proprietary trading and the likes. What we've seen in the equities world, on the first stage when they started implementing these floors, we saw these sort of micro-level volatilities where prices shot up and down very quickly, but those are more or less disappeared when the algorithms have gotten better and the governance around them have gotten better. So fundamentals will always drive volatility in the markets, but it seems like we are going to the right direction from a governance point of view that the automation itself shouldn't create too much volatility. More, it's actually reducing the volatility in a sense that, for example, the role of TSOs in the power markets will likely be smaller because we have more and higher frequency optimization between the market players rather than having a TSO act in the middle. So I wouldn't expect to see a huge surge in volatility just because of automation.
I think there's a direct link with volatility on the political sphere with the same technologies that will give rise to your level 4. Also, if you read the Frey and Osborne study on the impact of artificial intelligence on jobs, they predict 47% of US and UK white-collar jobs gone by 2035, 60+% of total jobs globally. What the impact that has on business models that are based on mass economics, whether it's retail, whether it's ports, whether it's airports, you name it. What you see is a lot of businesses losing purchasing power, aggregate demand going down, a lot of governments losing income tax, losing business rates, losing VAT, losing the capacity, look at Northamptonshire Council, to meet on the basic needs of their citizens. Layer onto that an indirect effect of an energy system driven by climate emissions, where the World Bank projects 140 million climate refugees by 2040, and what that's going to do to open borders. Layer onto that the death tango between job loss through automation and populism, the pressure for protectionist policies that again depress demand. I think what you can see is that big picture, there are a lot of drivers for some major waves and potential sources of volatility in the markets.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting from a market standpoint. I always think of speculation in the market driving markets in the direction that they would move anyway from a fundamental perspective, but accelerating that and maybe exacerbating that. So I think it depends on how the algorithms are programmed. If algorithms are programmed to observe the fundamental pressures in the market and constantly look at the balance of supply and demand in certain locations where things are traded, then maybe they'll stay much more true to the fundamentals. Whereas if they're programmed to do things like follow momentum, then they will exacerbate and accelerate the fundamental movements in exactly the same way as the funds do today. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the balance between supply and demand that moves the market in the direction that it moves. It's getting tighter or it's getting looser, and the price adjusts accordingly. So it really depends how these machines are programmed as to whether or not we'll see more or less volatility.
That's exactly the right point, and to spice it up even further, I mean, if you look at, for example, the oil traders, typically how they make money is they want to front the market. Right? They have some information and they want to go quicker than the market to take a big position. So it's, in a sense, a very discretionary trading. But if you look at the systematic trading world, you actually don't make, big bets, and you make, large amount of small bets, because the market is already at that efficient level that you cannot front the market with a big position anymore. So in a sense, we are catching up the fundamental levels quicker, and the algorithms typically in a very highly liquid market are not trying to sort of make big bets on the direction. They're actually just trying to arbitrage the market or capture very short-term things. And in that sense, it's very difficult to create a huge volatility, but it remains to be seen.
Antti, Leo, Leigh, thank you very much for sharing your insights. And now please join me in